Everyone knows those couples who are a little bit too close, who do everything together, and they just begin to become one person. Well, that's the premise of the movie Together, a new body horror film from Neon starring Allison Brie and Dave Franco that takes a very literal approach to these ideas that infuses it into the body horror mode of storytelling. And we're going to discuss together and see if you're in this type of relationship. So if these signs that I'm about to read off sound at all familiar, maybe you should reconsider everything going on with your life as two people begin to fuse together. Sign number 1, when staying feels easier than leaving. So we have this couple of Millie and Tim, who are a couple who've been together for a while, probably nearing about 10 years. And they've just gotten so used to each other and being this couple and what that means as a status. They don't seem to enjoy each other's presence, but say they do. It is all about appearances. They do love each other. I want to make that very clear, and I think that's something smart that the film is able to localize. And that is that these two characters of Millie and Tim do have a love for one another that is genuine. So many times you see a film like this and you think it's gone to the point of resentment and hatred. That's not what Together is. There is a care that these two people have for one another, but it is also exploring a relationship that is maybe past its time. And I think that is a really smart way to characterize it. That you do see a love, but you don't see the passion of love. Tim is checked out. This is the character played by Dave Franco. He is so worried about his music. Meanwhile, you have Millie, who wants physical affection that Tim is unable to give her. Everyone around them can tell that they are having real issues too, but again, they don't want to acknowledge that. They want to put forth their best effort and say, this relationship's great. Yes, all couples have these problems. We're just like everyone else. When maybe their problems are a bit more serious than they're letting on to the world, but they want to put on this happy face for this 21st century social media appearance that they are so focused on. Which, speaking of social media, I hope you guys consider subscribing to my YouTube channel. It helps me out so tremendously. And I also hope you consider following me on social media, Letterboxd, TikTok, Instagram, at Ben Talks Film. Getting back into this movie, I think it's a really smart way to introduce these two characters played by Allison Brie and Dave Franco as a couple that essentially has stopped evolving. And that is the tension of this film, is them having to work through that or end up in a disaster situation. They care for each other a lot, but they also secretly resent each other. And it's a smart way to get the drama beginning from the movie. You expect the body horror elements to be the terror of this film, but we actually see it much earlier on with the social interactions that these characters are having, the situational awkwardness that they are putting each other in and everyone around them. I think that's a really clever way to get you involved into this story headfirst. And I think this film has that great introduction. Sign 2 that you might be in a together relationship. It's always about them. And Together shows the failures of Millie and Tim and why they are growing apart, why they are in stagnant, what they are doing to each other, and why this relationship has grown cold. And I think the film divides it in the first act. We're really getting to explore Tim and his side of this. We then, in the second act, explore a lot more of Millie. And then in the third act, we're seeing this fusion of flesh, quite literally. And my criticism of this movie, and this was a huge issue that I had in the first act of the film, is I think this film introduces us and it wants us to take Tim's side initially. And I think it portrays Millie a little bit more harsh than it ever does Tim. And I just don't think the film actually is able to convince that. I actually think Millie is pretty well justified in everything that she's doing in this movie and how she sees her life going and their life together. All of Tim's friends are saying Millie is making him miserable and isolated. He doesn't want to move out to the woods. He wants to focus on his music career, and she's putting this pressure on him. It's kind of this reoccurring idea in the first few minutes of this film that Millie is supposed to be very controlling of this relationship, and no one's really on Millie's side. I think that's a pretty bad depiction of this in this movie, and I think it works to a really poor screenwriting decision. Together starts off very anti-Millie, And this is the danger of having a director slash screenwriter who are men, where it does feel like Millie's agency isn't thought of and that she's being portrayed in the classical sense of a controlling, nagging wife. I don't think this is a fair characterization. And again, I do think this film is able to work past that. But in the beginning, this was really annoying me, especially because it's very apparent that this character of Tim is a bad boyfriend. And listen, this issue does resolve itself, and I think as the film focuses more on Millie and Allison Brie gets to take the more leading role in this film, I think it's far superior. I also think that's due to the fact that Allison Brie is just a generally better actor than Dave Franco. So I think she is more game for taking control of this movie. And it also helps that the craziest parts of this movie and the more insanity happens with Allison Brie, who is really able to channel that mode of performance very well. She's been able to show that in comedies such as Community. She's been able to show that in her dramatic work throughout her career. So she's just game for whatever this film throws at her as the film goes along. Sign number 3 that you might be turning into a together relationship is when intimacy becomes invasion. So let's talk about the body horror aspect of this movie, which is Millie and Tim go adventuring in the woods and fall into a cave. And the next day they wake up and notice their legs beginning to stick together. And this is where the body horror begins. And it's very gradual and it's very gross, but it gets grosser as the film goes along to the point where it just becomes pure insanity. And this is supposed to quite literally bring forth the idea of Genesis 2:24. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And at first, they don't understand what's going on. And as it becomes more severe, that's when the characters start to realize something bad has probably just happened to us. Tim begins to get seizures whenever Millie goes too far away. They have to have this closeness, or their bodies begin to shut down. And it becomes very upsetting. And the film quickly elevates itself. And it just all starts to scale up. When this movie finally hits a 10 in its insanity, I think that's when the movie becomes extremely fun. And of course, with a movie about a relationship and a couple, intimacy is really key. And yes, there is a very memorable sex scene in this movie that is extremely upsetting. It's gross and it's incredibly funny. When this film is able to play and balance all 3 of those, I think it is working so much to this film's benefit, and the energy is just alive in this movie, and it's pretty electric to watch. For the first hour of this film, I found Together to be quite self-serious, and as it shifts a little bit more comedic in the second half of this film, I think it works to far better effects, and I was having far more fun with it. Which leads me into sign number 4, confrontation avoided, horror ignored. And this is basically me talking about what type of horror film I like to see, which I've seen this about myself on this channel. I don't always enjoy horror films. It has to be a very specific type of horror film. And when I do typically enjoy this, it's when the genre is used to reflect real human emotions, our existence, the state of our world, and cultural anxieties. That's what I've really enjoyed on this channel. Looking at 3 recent horror films that I've reviewed in the past year, you have The Substance, you have Terrifier 3, and you have Final Destination Bloodlines. All 3 of these films are incredibly gross, and yet I find The Substance to be the most successful of them, which is just an incredibly gross, gory, fun feminist body horror that explores societal pressures on women to maintain youth and beauty, body images as defined by celebrity culture, misogyny, and self-perception. That's where I think horror is just a really cool avenue to explore these ideas. And I love that The Substance is able to just dial this up to a 20. This movie goes so insane. That's what I find fun, where the movie is quite literally beating you over the head with its message. Then there's other films that I've reviewed, like Terrifier 3 and Final Destination Bloodlines, that I'm more mixed on. They are serving a similar purpose to films like Together, to films like The Substance, in the fact that they are very gross. They do have a lot of body horror in them, but it's gross, but not revealing. And I get very bored with these films very quickly, and it just becomes a kill fest obsessed with gore and bloodlust. And let's just talk about Final Destination's Bloodlines, this being the biggest horror film of the summer by a pretty good margin. I get the appeal of this movie, and I think this movie has it in success. It's supposed to be tapping into this primal fear of death and the randomness of death. I like that idea. I think it works in these movies. I have an issue with the CGI quality of these movies that I just found to be a little poor. But what detracts me from Final Destination or a Terrifier 3 is that the mode of storytelling seems to be what is the most shocking and gruesome thing we can do next. In a film like Together, I think it is how can we evolve the character in this next moment, which I find just far more enjoyable to consume. It also takes away a lot of my anxieties while watching these movies, that I'm having a good time, not just kind of sitting there like, this is gross. I get it, but it's very gross. So I'm glad Together fell into this former, where it is a movie that is exploring relationships, it's exploring intimacy, it's exploring connection, it is sharing a life together, it is becoming more like your partner. I found that very relatable, me being somebody who is in a very committed relationship, and we are making big next steps coming up really soon in our lives. This film captures the subconscious fears that come along with caring for somebody, and also sharing a life together. And also it explores how we develop into one another, how I begin to take her habits, her interests, her cadence, vice versa. A few years ago, before we met, I was not throwing birthday parties for cats, and she was not a Sacramento Kings fan. When you enter into a relationship, you start to share some of your interests and hobbies, and it becomes their interest and hobby. But what this film is also expertly able to display is it's about people who wrestle with not always seeing eye to eye, and what that means, how this affects this couple in this film, and also how it affects all couples in real life. And it's this codependency that these two characters have, and this idea of codependency versus independency, and having different tastes, wants, hobbies, fears, and boundaries. I think that is what this movie is able to capture, is these two people who are just relying on each other too much and are having issues because of it, and they are starting to morph into the same person before the actual body horror even begins to happen, and they're starting to lose their agency and independency. Which brings us quite nicely to sign number 5, and the last one that I want to talk about today. You don't know who you are anymore, which I think is a big thematic idea of Together, which is this reoccurring theme within this movie of putting on a mask for the world. There's only 2 times that we see the outside world's perspective on these 2 characters' relationship. One is at the very beginning of this film, where the friends are at this party hosted for these 2 friends. And the other one is when we are introduced to the character played by Damon Harriman, who plays Jamie in this film. He is a co-worker of Millie's, who Millie begins to express some of her frustrations with her partner. And this is another moment where we start to see the mask slip off, and you're seeing these reoccurring conversations. What are people willing to sacrifice for each other, and what does true love look like? And can a couple that is having some of these problems and are in some of these fights, can they rebound? Are they able to make the most of it and actually learn what that means to be together, or are they going to be damned for eternity in some ways? I don't want to spoil this movie, but that is the ultimatum of this movie, and it's wrestling with that until its final moments. I do want to say that I don't think the ending fully sticks the landing. Thematically, I got it. I thought the execution was a little silly. I'm not going to spoil that for anybody, but you'll know exactly what I mean when you see this film. But overall, I did find Together to be an imperfect movie, but one that finds its footing the longer it goes about. And I do think when this movie hits the third act, that is when the blend of comedy, horror, insanity, and emotion all kicks in. And I think this movie is a rip-roaring good time. I am going to recommend this movie. I think this is a very fun, is a very digestible horror movie that is able to play with a very disgusting type of subject matter and grossness to a screen, but is actually something that I think a lot of general audiences will enjoy if they give the chance. I'm going 3.5 out of 5 stars. So thank you to everyone who watched this video. Again, I hope you consider subscribing to this channel, and I hope you consider following me on all social media at Ben Talks Film.